Hello everybody, my name is Benedict Posmatiophilus and today I'm going to tell you about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, something that is considered one of the most cruel and unethical experiments in the United States history. Before we dive deeper into the topic and learn more about what happened in Tuskegee in the span of 40 years, we need to establish some basic understanding about what it actually is so that we don't get lost in conspiracy and other misinformation about history. So, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention on a group of nearly 400 African Americans with syphilis. Their object of research were mostly men, and they were almost invariably poor and unprivileged, as is common with a lot of African American men at the time. The purpose of this research is to find out what happens to someone who is suffering from syphilis if the problem itself is not being treated. In order to track the disease's full progression, researchers provided no effective care as the study's African American participants experienced severe health problems, including blindness, mental impairment, and death. So there's a timeline, a short timeline diagram, a small timeline diagram for the whole thing. Uh, Everything began in 1932 when the USPHS contacted the Tuskegee Institute in Macon, Alabama, to basically ask them to start a study about how syphilis will affect people if they are untreated. In the mid 1940s, when penicillin became available, uh, the men in the study are still refused treatment because they still wanted to know what happens if syphilis goes untreated for a long time. This causes a lot of issues within the men, such as blindness, even mental impairment, physical impairment, and in a lot of cases, even death. In 1972, however, it was the first time that the study is being exposed to the world. A journalist by the name of Paul Buxton, Peter Buxton, found out about the Tuskegee study and expressed his concern to his superiors that this was unethical. But his words are not treated well, and he is ignored. And so he leaked the news to his friend, who's also a journalist, who then published it into the public. And then in that same year, an ad hoc advisory board was created, and then the study is forced to stop. It was until 1997 that President Clinton, or any president for that matter, issues a formal presidential apology for the victims of the experiment itself. So, as we all know, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was considered unethical by a lot of people. But why is it the case? The first thing is that there is no evidence that researchers obtained informed consent from the participants, and the participants were not offered available treatments even after penicillin became widely available. As I've said before, the researchers didn't ask the participants for their informed consent. So although the participants said yes to the experiment, they didn't know the full extent of it. They didn't know that they are about to be given syphilis and be observed to what happens to people when they suffer syphilis and go untreated. And they are also not given the option to opt out of the experiment because, as I've mentioned earlier again, even when penicillin became available, the researchers refused to treat them with proper healthcare. So There is no doubt that an event as large and long-lasting as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study will have a long-lasting impact on the community that it was performed on. In this case, it is the Black or the African American community, even today. Those impacts can be divided into three. The first one is medical racism, second one is scientific failings, and the third is public trust. So the first and foremost impact is, of course, racism. There's this conception which lay behind the US Public Health Service Syphilis Study at Tuskegee in 1932, in which 100% of its participants were poor, rural African-American men with very limited access to health information, and that reflects the racial attitudes in the US at the time. So the US government decided that it would be best to perform this shady and uncertain experiment on people who are uneducated, poor, and do not know any better, and can basically be cast aside like animals. And in that time, better to treat that way than the population of the country that had just been freed from slavery. So Black Americans, basically, they didn't have anything. They didn't have access to better education. So they didn't even know that there's an option to ask the researchers about what they were doing. So they just accepted the syphilis shots. And even when they're sick, they didn't know how to properly treat themselves or how to call the researchers out if and when they lie about the existence of penicillin. The second legacy of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is the scientific failings. Despite the clinicians' attempt to justify the study as necessary for science, the study itself was not conducted in a scientifically viable way. Because participants were treated with mercury rubs, injections of neo-arsenophenamine, iodide, sulfasan, bismuth, and the study did not follow subjects whose syphilis was untreated. However, minimally effective these treatments may have been. So basically, they just gave the syphilis shots and a lot of other things to those people, and then they left them to hang dry, basically. And of course, this doesn't stand to the scientific standard of the time and of any time. So even though the clinicians and the researchers try to justify their actions as something necessary for science, their arguments really hold no water at the end of the day. And the biggest and most permanent legacy of the Tuskegee study is the public distrust, especially amongst African Americans. The revelations of mistreatment under the US Public Health Service Syphilis Study at Tuskegee are believed to have significantly damaged the trust of the Black community toward public health efforts in the United States. Observers believe that the abuses of the study may have contributed to the reluctance of many poor Black people to seek routine preventive care. This sentiment is also reflected in the present day when the COVID vaccine is beginning to roll out. A lot of people, especially African Americans, cite the event at Tuskegee as some sort of justification for them not getting the COVID vaccine. Although it is a wrong stance to have, as vaccines undoubtedly save lives, if one were to look at the history of mistreatment and systematic oppression that Black Americans faced ever since their arrival to America, one can see why that mindset developed between them as a community. So, fortunately, although there's truly nothing that can recompensate the loss of life, the American government have tried to several things in order to alleviate the pains of the survivors of the Tuskegee study, if not them, then at least their descendants. Throughout the subsequent decades, through a long legal process, the United States government finally did something to alleviate the pains of those affected by what happened in Tuskegee. The United States government did quite a lot of things actually to their credit. And the first thing they did is establish the National Research Act and the OHRP, or Office for Human Research Protections, which is an organization that protects human subjects in any field of research, especially medical science. So in 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act and created a commission to study and write regulations governing studies involving human participants. Within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Human Research Protections, or the OHRP, was established to oversee clinical trials. So their job is to basically make sure that something as cruel and inhumane as Tuskegee never happens again, by setting a couple of rules and a couple of regulations for researchers of any field to follow. In this modern day, thanks to the National Research Act and the OHRP, studies require informed consent, communication of diagnosis, and accurate reporting of test results. Basically, ever since Tuskegee, if a researcher wants to contact you to be their human test subject, they need to first educate you on the research, on the topic of the research, on the methods, on the expected results. And even though you consent to the research, your consent needs to come from a place of understanding the whole thing rather than being forced to consent, because there's no such thing as forced consent. And besides that, the researchers also have to give options for you to go out, to opt out of the research anytime you want, if you feel that the research or the trials they do on your body is affecting you in a negative way. Furthermore, the researchers also need to have a clear line of communication between you and them that is constantly updating the conditions, and also an diagnosis. Diagnosis is important because you, as the test subject, have the right to know what goes on in your body. And also, they need to accurately report the test results. Besides the establishment of the National Research Act and the OHRP, there are also several kind gestures that the United States government gave to the victims and survivors of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The first one is the formal presidential apology by President Bill Clinton, where he invited the survivors of Tuskegee into the White House, and they talked, and he declared a formal apology for what the United States government had done to them. And it happened on May 16, 1997. In 2009, the Legacy Museum opened in Bioethics Center to honor the hundreds of participants of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the African American male. So basically, that museum serves to honor, but also to remind future generations to never again sacrifice the life of humans in the name of science. And in June 2022, which is last month, the Milbank Memorial Fund apologized to the descendants of the study's victims for its role in the study. So, to conclude, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study is an experiment done by the CDC and USPHS from 1932 to 1972. The goal of the experiment is to find out what happens to a body if a syphilis case is not treated. However, they broke a lot of ethical codes at the time by, one, not fully informing the test subjects of what is going on and what the test itself will do to their body, and two, purposefully picking the most underprivileged and undereducated group at the time, which was African Americans, so that they don't have to face a lot of setbacks in their research. The third is that they didn't provide treatment and options to bail out of the research, even though treatment was available, aka penicillin. And the test itself cost the life of 400 African American men. Only 8 survived to this very day. It took the United States government until 1972 to finally stop the study, and until 1997 to finally apologize to all of the survivors. And even worse, it takes them until 2022 to recognize the descendants of those who have been affected and then issue a formal apology. All in all, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study is an experiment that is very inhumane, unethical, and another form of the systemic discrimination and oppression that African Americans face in their daily lives ever since they first started their history in the United States. Although the past cannot be buried, at least the United States government have tried, although not to their very best yet, to alleviate and fix the injustices that they have done in the past. We can only hope that as time goes on, many more injustices can be recognized and be corrected in the present. That is all from me. Thank you.